Sadanga yoga natu naiva shudam. Anavanasham natu naiva shudam. Guru padesham natu naiva shudam. Svayam chatatvam. Svayam eva bhutam. Om shantihi, shantihi, shantihi. The self is certainly not made pure by practice of the six-limbed yoga. It is not made pure by the destruction of the mind's vrittis or thoughts. The self is not purified by merely bowing at the Guru's feet. The self is eternally pure, and thou art that. And there shines Brahman. May that Brahman protect us, may that Brahman sustain us, and may that Brahman illumine our thinking process. May we not find fault with each other, with the world, or with the teachings, and may what we study be a source of inspiration to us eternally. Om peace, peace, peace. May peace be unto us, and may peace be unto all. Om Hari Om, Hari Om, Hari Om Tat Sat. Aloha and namaste from the SRV Association's Sloka. We're live streaming here from Hawaii. As you might be able to see, it's a sort of a holy day. I've been garlanded with a Hawaiian lei because it's Father's Day. And so I will wear this somewhat reluctantly for class. It adds to the beautification of everything. And we're looking into, I think, what is now the fifth class on this subject of the Avadhut's Gita, you might say. Avadhuta Gita, there in chapter 3 of that scripture, there are some 40 verses. If you have 40, it's usually called chalisa, like the Hanuman chalisa or Ramakrishna chalisa that we've been singing lately, written by a man who is still living in India. So this particular set of 40 verses ends with that refrain, Jnanamritam samarasam gagano pamoham. Gagano is ether. So I'm just like the ether. I'm all pervading. That is, my true self is. If I try and apply that to my little self, then try and be all pervading, I'll walk into a wall and hurt myself, possibly stagger around, bumping into things, because the physical is not that. And it's precisely what I was chanting as we began. I was chanting from chapter 1, sloka 48 of the Avadhuta Gita, where he says Sadanga means six, Sadanga yoga, which we've been studying lately, the six-limb yoga of Vedanta, just almost exactly like the eight-limbed yoga of Patanjali, except in Vedanta's case with Sadanga yoga, you rather start with pranayama and move inward. If you call that center-wise, you start there at the Manipura, in the junction between the stomach and the heart, if you want to physically allocate it, and you move inward to higher centers after taking Mother Kundalini or Mother Saraswati into the central channel and bring her up. And so that follows more the sixth chakra system, 5 chakra maybe in Vedanta, and follows the Sadanga, sixth-limbed yoga. As maybe they figure that yamas and niyamas, those 2 sets of 5s, have already been accomplished by beings who are thinking in terms of yoga at all, or thinking in terms of being out of yoga, which probably is where most people begin nowadays. I feel out of balance, out of sorts. So that's being out of yoga, because yoga means that balance and oneness with your true nature. So he sings that earlier in this same scripture. Sadanga natu, I am not, or is not. That is, the self is not made pure by six-limbed yoga practice, by any practice. And it's not made pure by the later advances in yoga, like, well, I have to quell the vibrations of my mind, the chitta vrittis, and stop those. Oh, all of a sudden I'm in yoga. Well, maybe temporarily, depending on what happens to you when you still the mind's thoughts. Sometimes there can be as Patanjali has said, a kind of blankness that attends your meditation, or the gunas are still in operation, or you're thinking you're still having problem with attachment and aversion, or you come upon the subtle bliss, which is not the self. Those are 4 different obstacles which the father of yoga describes to us in this move towards purifying the mind of its thoughts, quelling the thoughts, being able to actually switch them off as if you had a switch inside. So he says, mano vinasham, destroying the mind, basically. Vinasha means to destroy. That's not, that doesn't purify the self either. And then finally he goes, Guru Padesham, the instructions of the teacher, or pada means feet, going to bow at the feet of the Guru, that also will not purify the self. And then the Advaitic solution, just because they're pure, the self is ever pure. Svayam cha tattvam, svayam eva buddham. That's that buddham, is that intelligence. It's ever pure, it doesn't need purification. It would be a very good place to start out with if practitioners had the wherewithal to and the support of, say, Guru, Sangha, and scriptures. Whereas we've been saying lately, Guru, method, mantra, and practice. If they had all those in place, then they could start out their practice with this advanced thinking, which we call Advaita Vedanta, and then do their practice. Some people hear about this advanced thinking and then they just assume that it's true and they don't do their practice. So that causes a fall usually. But this is a very beautiful and poignant verse. It's of the Avadhuta Gita. It's the first of the verses that I ever memorized decades ago. And then now here I am several decades later, singing you 40 more in the later chapters, the Avadhut's own Gita, his own conclusion that Jnanamritam, I am that wisdom, that nectar of nondual wisdom, which we're just talking about here. Samarasam, it's like there's nothing more satisfying than that rasa, than that nectar of non-dual truth. And the only thing that he can describe to you by way of analogy or metaphor is it's indivisible like the ether, and elevated and wide open like space. So that's what we've been singing for 5 Sundays, with a couple weeks of break then when we had the retreat that we just came back from. So last week we picked that up, and this week I got to thinking about the 3 slokas. I'm trying to go 3 slokas at a time in this Gita. So I decided yesterday that a chart was in the making in my mind. So I have a new chart for you, fresh off the printer this morning, thankfully. And so we're going to look at that, and the focus becomes more about the mind's fascination, moha is the word, fascination with rebirth and nature. And if you're talking about these great fathers of yoga like Patanjali, then you would know that some of his sutras, in the Yoga Sutras, those 4 padas, those sections, he talks about that problem of fear of death, clinging to life, and how it, like Buddha had talked about it some 600 or 700 years probably before Patanjali, that he had also talked about it in terms of samsara, or kala chakra, a wheel of transmigration, that so many millions and millions of souls find themselves caught on. If you go back a couple ages to Sri Krishna's Gita, from Avadhuta Gita, you'll find out that Krishna is saying the same thing. They're caught on the regimen of Prakriti, turning like a device on a wheel. It's like a figurine on a wheel, just not be able to get off of this. And remember last week we looked at that double helix of Maya. It was a chart right here, if you can recall it in your mind's eye, of this double Mayic figure. And she's turning, and as she turns, souls are looking at that and they're saying, like the soul is looking into its own mind and becoming fascinated. But the case with this mind here in this new chart, we might as well go to it, and I'll sing you the verses that accord to it. The case with this soul that's in this image right there is that it's not fascinated with nature anymore. It's fascinated by the fact that it got so fascinated by nature. And it's now seen that it's different from nature. And that difference is what we want to try and talk about today. It's difference in non-difference. Beta, they call that. Basically, well, I'll get to it by degrees here, but actually people were thinking that nature, the soul that gets fascinated by nature, must have some sort of an awareness of itself as a mind mechanism. Mind means mind, thought, intellect, and intelligence. It's intelligence. So its intelligence must have gotten covered when it looked out and saw nature, and its first thought was, that's beautiful, that's different. And it should have said, that's inside of me, that's the same as me. So it's a very razor's edge path. Talk about utistata jagrata prapya varani bodhata, that this razor's edge path is very difficult to navigate. So you're going to hear that you have to separate yourself from nature according to beings like Patanjali and Shankara and so forth. And then only to find out that you had to separate yourself from nature, not because it was actually something that you considered separate from yourself, and then you moved to embrace it. And this is outside the body. Before you get into the body, you decided to take a body in nature. And so I'm trying to explain some of the dynamics here that they would talk about if they were teaching you the Dharma from Far East, from India, in these different darshanas, and trying to explain to you how you got into the body. Because once you're in the body, it's like nobody remembers. You've come through this thick curtain of nescience, they call it. And that's stripped all your memory of the past lifetime away. And it happens to everyone. The avatars recover that back after they come through that curtain of nescience within years. Like Shankara I just mentioned, within 8 years he had remembered all his past lifetimes. And Krishna is there probably as a mid 30-year-old man on the battlefield with Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita saying, I remember all my lifetimes, Arjuna. So they retrieve rather this memory of having past lifetimes in realization of the fact that they were not nature, but that nature was within them. So that's kind of a long-winded way of saying what we're going to be talking about today in this accent we're having on separation and non-separation, and how it applies basically to the wheel of transmigration, the series of lifetimes. It's like if you were to have one lifetime like the Videha Muktas do, those who get free from bodies, they have one lifetime look at it and say, oh, I see the potential ruse, the potential wool that could be pulled over my mind, and over my eyes, by thinking that I'm separate from nature and I want it, then I want to unite with it. And once I do, there goes my true self, because I'm uniting with something that is different in consistency than my consciousness. But it's not different in locale. It's that nature is within you, and you're one and the same in that way. So the consistency, the content of matter is different than the content of consciousness. So you're going to have to make a kind of double move on the double helix of Maya and say to yourself when you see it, oh, that came out of me. And once that's done, no problem, because you don't have to go searching for it anymore because it's already there. So you can say, ignorance begins, Patanjali says, we'll read that. Ignorance begins there when you rush to unite yourself with nature. That's where ignorance started. Because you wouldn't be rushing to unite yourself with nature if you had to realize that that's just an extension of yourself. You would just see that the origin of nature is within you. Earth, air, fire, water, and ether, hearing, tasting, touching, seeing, smelling, sets of fives are back inside of you. And if you lost track of that one very tiny but very significant fact that's Advaitic in nature, then you enter into this wheel of birth and death at a disadvantage. And then your mind starts to think of yourself as being born and dying and being suffering and being happy. There it loses its certainty that it is the self. As Patanjali put it, it's the witness of everything. It's the seer, and nature is the seen. And the seen should be under control by the seer. But in his day and age, and that's why Buddha had come 500 or 600 years before him, people were seeing it through a glass darkly. They're seeing it opposite, that they were born in nature, and nature they were slave to nature. So the world is, you are not in the world is in you, is how Vivekananda put that. So if those great sayings could be fathomed and contemplated, then, and you took that into your conscious death, that is your passing, then you would remember that for all times. It would be the one thing that when you came into the body next time and looked at nature and said, that's a beautiful thing. Oh, I see, it's just in me. It's just an expression of what I'm seeing, tasting, touching, hearing, smelling. And its solidity, its liquidity, its radiance, its homogeneity, and its transcendence. That's what earth, air, fire, water, and ether, or in order, earth, water, fire, air, and ether, are all about in your mind. There's words for them. Say the word, takes a while, then the worlds are formed out of these. The worlds are formed out of words, see, out of bijams. So a little introduction to get us rolling into this particular triple verses of the Avadhuta's chalisa. I'll sing them to you first, as we've been doing that for the last 4 classes. Samsara satati nacha nachame kadachit santosha santati sukho nachame kadatit agyana bandhanamidam nachame kadachit Jnanamritam samarasam gaganopamoham samsara santatirajo nachame vikara santapa santatitamo nachame vikara sattvam swadharma janakam nachame vikara Jnanamritam samarasam gaganopamoham santapa dukkha janako navidika dachit Santapa yoga janitam namanaha karachit yasmadahan katiryam nachame karachit Jnanamritam samarasam gaganopamoham Jnanamritam samarasam gaganopamoham. And so he sings to us, and I'll just give you straight out the English for it all. He says, the clinging creeper of birth and death has fallen off my true body. And I have found that the happiness and miseries that belong to life are not in my true self. Instead, I am pure existence, wisdom, and bliss, as boundless as the sky, and infinite like space. He continues, the guna of Rajas fabricates and drives the world, not I. And the suffering that attends it is the work of tamas, not of myself. Even that sought-after happiness brought to bear by sattva, balance, is not my doing. For I am pure existence, wisdom, and bliss, as boundless as the sky and infinite like space. In verse 15, then, he sings, contemplating my dreamlike past, I found that I never performed the action that brought about suffering. I never owned a mind complex with which to create pleasure and pain either. I found that the ego is an onerous phantom, devoid of substance. Thus I concluded, once and for all, that I am pure existence, wisdom, and bliss, as boundless as the sky and infinite like space. So he's not even 15 verses into the 40-verse chalisa of this third chapter of the Avadhuta Gita, and he's already hitting the depths of so many Advaitic axioms and explaining them in his own unique way. So when I contemplate these verses 3 a week, in this case, I thought these 3 warranted a chart. Remember the last verses where I am the fire of living intelligence that burns the sins of the one who has no sins. I am the fire of living intelligence that burns the births of that who has no birth. That's kind of what he's continuing on with here. And so I made a chart about that, calling it here, and we can look at it, the mind's fascination with samsaric transmigration. Quote, it drags from birth to death and death to birth the soul. And so all of my students, at least, and those who are devotees of Sri Ramakrishna and followers of Swami Vivekananda immediately think Song of the Sannyas and those verses that he sings there. Wake up to note, the song had its birth far off. And then let darkness go, the will of the wisp that leads with blinking light to pile more gloom on gloom. That thirst for life, it drags from birth to death and death to birth of soul. So forever quench it, he says. And so he's speaking to beings who are in a kind of wonderment, you see. And you can see at the head of this chart is moha monomaya. So basically moha means delusion, Mano means mind, and Maya means, of course, this deluding power that is consisting of name, nama, form, rupa, desha, space, kala, time, and nimitta, cause and effect, right? Name, form, time, space, cause and effect. That's how Vivekananda told us at a time when everyone was calling Maya an illusion. But later on, he was to speak a lecture where he called Maya is a statement of fact, not an illusion. So he really corrected a lot of things about the thinking of people who were beginning to encounter the Vedanta and Indian ways of philosophy in 1893 when he appeared at the Parliament of Religions. So that was one of the things he clarified for us. So we could, what does he mean by statement of fact? We could look at that and see how Maya is the foundation of all of these things that we call life, particularly if we call them worldly life, earthly life, relativity, and so forth. So it wasn't until you were able to transcend Maya that you would see Mahamaya, what's beyond Maya, the real controller there. And in that way, then he would say things like, it drags from birth to death and death to birth of soul. That's ordinary life, this worldly life, this life divorced from this knowledge that you're separate from nature, but that nature's within you. So you're going to have to hold two ideals there. If you've come into it without that, with a kind of wonderment in your two eyes that is looking upon nature as something fascinating and beautiful, and you rush towards it to unite it with it, or contrast that, you come into this world with that look in your eyes that says, I remember this. Last time I got stuck in this, I got fascinated by name, form, time, space, and cause and effect, karma, and I'm still trying to wind the thread off of that spool of my mind. And I'm going to take another lifetime to have to do that. Then I'm going to have to come into that with a higher information, a deeper reckoning, a greater insight, a more profound wisdom. Jnanamritam samarasam. I'm going to have to go to the Avadhut or to an avatar or to a guru of higher wisdom and have this put straight early on, so I'm not going to run any more nadis, any more channels into my mind based in attachment to nature. Pretty much I sang this already. I can read it later just to remind us, but let's skip the quote for now. We've looked at this moha mano maya, moha delusion, mano mind, maya, that which is the underlying foundation of appearances, you might say. What you're going to need to practice, you're going to have to need to know about false superposition, and you're going to have to need to practice neti. Those are the two surefire ways of doing away with this problem of vivarta, taking nature to be real, taking yourself to be nature. Let's jump right to that. So this chart is not a real hard study, but you can see here that I put it under the heading of the soul's misapprehension of nature. Another word, of course, is prakriti for nature. So here's a kind of dynamic that I was giving a little hint to earlier, but which can be read out in this order so that it sort of describes the soul who is becoming embroiled in this fascination with the Kala Chakra, as Buddha called it, or the transmigration process, by the way, which happens in the three worlds, Bhur, Bhuva, Swaha. That's why the Gayatri starts out, Bhur, Bhuva, Swaha, Tat Savitur Varenyam. We want to send peace and light to all the beings who are still on this wheel of transmigration between the humans and the subhumans. There you see them right there, humans, subhumans, animals. They're all going through cycles, right? And then they're coming back again through Dharmaraja's net, and Dharmarajini is releasing them again back into life. It's a very beautiful image, and it covers, the plants aren't covered in there, but of course they're pretty much born in Prakriti. How can we say that? Birds have nests, foxes have holes, but you have no place to lay your head here. So these other beings are being considered as a more substantial evolutionary form, a body that has higher sensitivity to obedience, like with the animals, service, and with mankind, intelligence. So you can see it nicely put here. It's just into this, there's death, or we're calling him Dharmaraja or Yama. He's got several names. And beings are just coming in, as it were, bowing down in death to him. And then they still have this fascination with nature. They're being released through his wife, as it were, Dharmarajini, or the mother of birth, into the form of a fetus, a baby, a young child, a boy, and so forth. It reminds us, of course, of Shankar singing, when I was a baby, I was attached to my mother's breast. When I was a young boy, I was attached to sport. When I was a young man, I was attached to a young woman. When I was old, I was attached to anxiety. So there's 4 of those, you see. And then, alas, to the Supreme Brahman, I was never attached, because I just bought hook, line, and sinker that I was a body, and that my age determined me, and my form determined me, male, female, for instance. And then I believed in that so much that I just got, it's a nice word for today, recycled, send them back for regrooving, as they used to say back in the 60s. Like a record that's been wiped clean and then gets cut again in the old style of recording. You actually cut your songs on a record through a needle in the old days before tape was there. So you got a piece of plastic there around it and all free of grooves, and you regroove it, you see. So that's what people who don't know the truth of the self and its superiority to nature, the greater self, the smaller self, and so forth, because when you're talking about moha mano, the mind is deluded, it usually, if the delusion is thick enough, thinks itself to be a physical form. But in the intellectuals, that's not always true. In the intellectuals, they're starting to think of themselves as a brain. And I had an image of a huge brain here I was going to work into this chart, but it didn't work very well, clouded the issue. But we make a distinction between brain and mind in our tradition, Vedanta, and in Buddhism and so forth. And that's why you can have such things as a mind-only school and say, well, that's where everything's come from, because we found out nothing comes from Brahman. It doesn't give birth, it doesn't create life, and it doesn't die. Now, that's a much different set of statements than you'll find in most other world religions, where God's a creator and you're dependent on God for everything. Well, we could say you're dependent upon God for everything, but that God is the self, which is your own self. And therefore, you're, as Sri Ramakrishna says, you're looking upon your own self, and your own self is looking upon you when you're a mature devotee and you find God inside of yourself. Where else are you going to find that God? But you'll find out when you find that God, that nature gets put aside from that God can't be matter, that God can't be energy, God can't be thought. Those 3 things are nicely classified in the Upanishads. So if you knew this ahead of time, you say, if God is none of those, then what is that God? First you might say, what is he? And you say, well, actually, that's a gender. Because God is one, he can't have gender either. Can't be male or female. So we ought to call it that, with a capital T, to designate how powerful and prominent it is. So that's just going back to this image and how this transmigration is going all the time. They say in the scriptures that the human being is higher than the gods, higher than that God that is causing it to be born in other worlds again. You would have to go to Yama, to get your next location of birth. But if you were a realized soul, you'd go to Lord Brahma to get beyond birth. See? So the gods are of much different levels of, if you want to call them gods or powers, they're of much different degrees of intensity in their functions under the hands that guide everything. Like the Divine Mother has two hands, and inside there's creation, preservation, destruction going on, assigned to Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. And this detachment is, of course, fully developed there. So as we were saying here, as we work our way down to how beings get themselves fascinated so much with the transmigration process that most of them, first of all, don't know that there is another lifetime to have. That's how dense the mind has become. They think one and done. I better make the most of this life. It's not actually a bad philosophy, because then maybe you'll do something with your life and so forth, and you'll discover higher truth. But those realize that they've been born before, and they'll be born again based on karma and samsara rather than sin and damnation, or heaven and hell based on nirvana and liberation, nirvana and moksha, rather than based on hell and heaven. I'll have a seminar coming up soon about that, how the different looks of East and West give us that difference between salvation and moksha, liberation, and the ways in which you can arrive at such a high realization. So this explains the top half or top third of this chart, and we know what's going on here. Let's see what the dynamics are as pertinent to those souls who are caught in that web of time. Kala chakra. Chakra around Kala time. Remember, Namarupa Desha Kala. Kala was one of those factors of Maya. So their minds are being fascinated by the Maya. Maha, Mano, Maya. So here's the soul's misapprehension of nature, as I describe it. Think of it this way: as you're in deep sleep, you see, and you're in a kind of bliss. There's no problems, there's no ego, there's no worries. You don't have to go to work. You don't have to do anything but just relax in the perfect peace and equipoise of your own self. And then you see this beautiful thing, you see. And you're thinking it's outside of yourself. And so it's your first misapprehension, that there's this blue jewel, as it were. And I can go towards that, and I can get into it, and I can take on forms and names, and I can take journeys in space and time through that porthole. And so in order to explore that, then you're going to have to unite with that through its nadi, through its channel. So that soul that is not remembering that the great self is true and the small self is false, or that spirit or consciousness is true and that matter is not. Brahman Satya, Brahman is true, is real. Jagad Mithya, Jagad, the world, is not. So they've forgotten that. They'll go like this. They'll mistake nature as a separate entity. So the first thing they'll see is not, I'm going to manifest the worlds from inside of me and get into them and play, which is what an avatar would do, like Sri Krishna or Lord Buddha. He'd stand back from the wheel of time and insert himself into the cycle where other people are circling in, and all of a sudden he'll be born as a baby. Oh, there's a great shining child like Christ in the manger. And they don't know the first thing about where he came from or who he is, and he doesn't either for a while. So this is very much of a dumbing down. It's a delimitation of the great self to try and get itself down into this little form. Lord Vashishta has good teachings about that, and how to limit the self. So a man wanted to hide, so he went and hid under a pile of leaves. The wind blew him away. Then he found a little shack that had been built, and he hid in that, and it fell down around him. Then he saw this huge jug, so he got in this huge jug, but the kids started throwing rocks at it, cracked it, fell apart around him. Then he saw this elephant trap, a big pit dug in the ground, and so he got down in that. And this story goes on and on, that Lord Vashishtha is telling Ramchandra about this, the whole purpose being is that you are, this soul, like the soul we're trying to describe here, is just trying to limit itself down to the smallest bit of space it can possibly find and hide there. Sarupanyata bhava means tantra, it means running away from your true self. So you're going to hide everything that has to do with this expansive light that you are. You're going to throw every bit of darkness at it you possibly can. Right on down to creating a fable of a series of lifetimes you had, to living a dream instead of waking up to your true nature. So this is how Lord Brahma would describe it to Lord Vashishtha when he saw Manas doing this to himself lifetime after lifetime. Beautiful stories in Yoga Vashishtha if you want to look at them. So some examples of how the soul mistakes nature as a separate entity. Then it desires to possess it and unite with it. Well, you can see the folly here. If it sees something, say you saw something and you already had it back home, but you decided you wanted it. So you forgot you had it back home. So you rush towards it and you grab it, you buy it, you purchase this, you covet it, you take it home, and then you find out that you've got one at home too. So this is accumulation of things. So this is what happens with the soul that sees nature as separate from itself and then all of a sudden wants to possess it. It wants to possess all the beauty there, all the sparkle, the outer sparkle of things. That's why one song in India says, "Oh, small self, you're just a sparkling little fish, swimming on the surface where death has granted his fishing grounds. Quick, before he comes with his net and captures you, dive deep into the ocean of your own beauty. Dive deep, dive deep. Go seek Vrindavan in your heart," and so forth. So this is what happens to the soul who realizes that they've made a mistake in apprehension, that nature is actually one with the soul. And we'll get to the small distinctions around that in a second. So mistakes nature for a separate reality, desires to possess it, and unites with it. The rest is almost, anyone here could probably think, what would happen next, you see? Well, you lose the realization or recognition of your higher self. You dumb everything down. So you're going to have to shut the light out. The light of the true self is trying to tell you is that what are you doing? You're leaving home. That you're bound and hell-bent for leather and bound and determined to delimit yourself in this realm of nature and take birth after birth after birth after birth and have death after death after death after death and take an infinite amount of rounds on this cycle of Prakriti. Beings are bound by the regime of Prakriti, Krishna says, and they circle in that and come back again. And that's my lower nature, they're circling in. But they have to realize the life force by which everything's supported. Then they can get themselves up and out. This is why we breathe. We're recognizing the life force in us. And with that life source, as we waken it up and take it to higher centers, then it can open up channels in us called nadis, and we'll begin to see again. Our divine memory will come back, and we'll be able to see again who we truly are, possibly who we once were before we became fascinated with nature. And the next points are equally as imaginable. Falsely perceives itself as a changing entity. And it accepts birth and death as being real attributes. So they give themselves to the illusion of death. It's how our founder, like Six and peace and bliss be upon him, described it in one of his poems. They give themselves to the illusion of death or the illusion of finitude. And so this means you accept that you are born, you accept that you die. And everyone teaches you that. You probably hide the death for a while until you're maybe big enough to take it. But they celebrate the birth. And so everyone is raised in this culture and in this time particularly with the idea that I was nothing before and now all of a sudden I was born. Well, where did I come from? What is it that was born? First thing Ramana Maharshi would say if you sat in front of him, where did you come from? What is it that is being born that you're calling yourself? And what is it that's going to die that will become the end to yourself? So beginnings and ends, Krishna says, they don't exist. These are dreams people are having, false attributes, false superimpositions. So there it is, forget your higher self, begin to think yourself as a changing entity, and accept birth and death as being real. Here describing 799,099,099 beings on Earth today. Looking 8 billion people, and one in every million comes to realize the true nature of the self. But 6 billion of them have a chance because they believe in consciousness in some form. The other 2 billion are atheistic materialists, militant kind of people. They want to kill the self and everything, as Krishna says in the Gita. So this is not the end of it. Then they become content with happiness and suffering. That's the next point. So this is why, we can go back and read it now that we've looked at this, again, to remind ourselves what we just sang. Contemplating my dreamlike past, the series of lifetimes that I can look back on now because I've opened my inner eye of wisdom. There's Ramakrishna. Contemplating my dreamlike past, I found that I never owned a mind complex with which to create pleasure and pain. But here it's saying that you're content with happiness and suffering. That you have to be because you don't know anything better or anything higher. So the happiness becomes a surface happiness, and the suffering becomes something that you have to forbear. There's no way of getting rid of it. You can throw lots of things at it. In this day and age, medicines and scalpels and various things to try and keep your life in the body longer. But death happens inevitably to everyone. So you can see how these two are linked. Belief in birth and death being real, and happiness and suffering, you accept that in the offing. That's in the whole quotient for you. And this is the work of the ego. He says, the phantom of the ego when dissolved, the phantom of the ego then dissolved when I realized my dreamlike past that was a series of minds that I was dreaming in the mind-only schools. And the creeper of birth and death then fell off my true body. That's his Atman. He realizes his Atman is birthless and deathless. And happiness and sorrow, then I realized the happiness and sorrow that attends upon life does not belong to me. And suffering is the work of Thomas, not me. So all of a sudden he's bringing in a teaching that I don't think anyone wants to cast away, even a great realized soul like the Avadhut. It's the 3 gunas. They start off the whole picture, throw everything out of balance. Out of balance means life and nature. It's ironic, isn't it? This is what most people want. They want to try and get balance in life and nature. But nature started out by being the gunas having it thrown out of balance. Otherwise, look at all the beings that have come, from monkeys to apes, back to fishes and parameciums. Was that balance? Was that bliss? If we actually went through all of that, and now we're in human beings and we can't even live together peacefully in a world, is that your balance? that you're talking about. So he realizes that none of this belongs to me. And also Rajas, which works the planet. All the planets in time in the three worlds are worked by this restlessness called Rajas. And everyone's trying to get ahead by using Rajas to get more. So that doesn't belong to me either. So what could I conclude? Jnanamritam, the highest wisdom, is samarasam, is this most intense bliss that's possible by having nothing, having no mind is samarasam. Because rasam without the sama, without the balance, is rasam, is this pleasure that you're having with food, with relationships, with families and children being born to you, without knowing where they came from and where they're headed, and possibly in cycles. So I am pure existence, wisdom and bliss, boundless the sky, infinite like space. So the last entries down there, when it becomes content with happiness and suffering, it imagines its birth and death in nature repeatedly. So now it's settled, whether it knows it or not, it's settled into this continual rotation on the Kala Chakra in what they call samsara, the wheel of birth and death. And never knowing that there's a great self that's looking on to all of this. It's actually a very simple move, to move from the small ego to the great ego, the small self to the great self. That's going to be just to surrender up everything that the small ego is offering, is representing to you, and accept 100%, the great self inside of you. Open up to that. Because why? Well, you can see it here in Swami Vivekananda's beautiful saying, you are never in Maya, it is Maya that is in you. So be through with it. Be done with it forever. Know yourself to be the Atman, infinite like the sky, boundless like space. Those are metaphors, of course. Now let's turn a little bit from the dynamics of a soul that falls. This is very philosophically and practically put. It doesn't bring into the quotient lust, anger, greed, envy, pride, and all of the passions, all of the fetters, grief, and so forth. Everything that happens to you is contained within these few statements in this rendering. And those things, people, again, probably the closest you could say is they will forbear with those to have a body. For some reason, for some strange reason, they will be content with living in a body. And even though all of these sufferings and ephemeral enjoyments that pass come and go to them, they still somehow cling to it. This thirst for life forever quench. It drags from birth to death, death to birth, the soul. The lines after that, they conquer all who conquer self. Know this and never yield. So stand up once and for all for you being this unchanging, infinite, all-pervasive, birthless, deathless self, which is beyond time and space and does not suffer karma, like he's trying to tell us here. The happiness and sorrow that came, I realized it wasn't in me. In fact, I never even owned the mind which fabricated it. You see how beautiful it is. So the mind-only school is what, to me, is what this pair of eyes is like. Oh, I see that. It wants to lure me in to thinking that it's a separate paradise. So what do most dualistic religions and fundamentalist religions tell you? There's a paradise to attain somewhere beyond, maybe up there even. And there's some sort of place in which we can all go, see, that this will all be over. So at the same time, they want this all to be over, but yet they're clinging to it. They don't want it to end. Isn't it very strange? It's very strange that happens to people. They look for a paradise somewhere where this will all be over, but they themselves are clinging to this. Abhinivesha, that's called by yoga, by yogis. They cling to life. and fear of death. Might as well read this down here, since it pertains to that. Looking in the Yoga Sutras today of Patanjali, he said, even knowledgeable beings, what to speak of others, cling to life and fear death. But through detached observation of the union of the two principles of nature and soul comes recognition of their difference. Ignorance is the result of this union. With the loosing of this ignorance in the mind comes its end. And becoming fully dispossessed of it, the soul realizes its complete independence. Nice word for that if you know the language of yoga. It's called koivaya. It released himself from its fetters in nature, that I was a form, that I had a name. Because forms by the billions, you name them. What's the name? Is it just a word? No, it's an ego. You become, the name is the ego. So names and forms in time, wheels of time and space. In space, it's all physical. For instance, there's no internal space that you can go to unless it's a heaven that you're dreaming about, that is somewhere up in the physical space on Earth, somewhere up high. So the whole thing is then, as the father of yoga describes here, with the loosing of this ignorance in the mind comes its end. Comes the end of what? The ignorance or the mind? I like the way it's worded, both. You lose your ignorance and you lose your mind, both. They both go away. And you become dispossessed of them. Then you realize your true self, because the mind was in the way, because all of nature and the whole dream was in the mind. It wasn't in the Atman. It must be clear to us by now what he's saying in even these 3 verses alone. None of that was in me. Imagine his amazement, or anyone's amazement, when they see the machinations of nature and these cycles and all that's happening. We're all happening non-actually in the mind. They're being dreamed in the mind, just like you dreamed last night about something and it's not there anymore. It's gone. It wasn't real. So this is, like I said, not that much philosophically put. Neither does it include all the teachings of suffering that and attachment to pleasure that are innate in these statements. It's the closest way you could put it in terms of the soul's fascination with nature. If you could just get rid of that, then the rest would go away. So it's not like you're going to have to get in and and say, oh, suffering is, like Buddha said, you see, and then say, it has an origin, it has an end. You're going to have to go back at it like that, but you'll end up with this realization that the mind was doing it all. But the Buddha mind isn't doing that. The Buddha mind is no mind. The no mind is the Atman, it's the Buddha nature. Let's look at it then from both sides now and look at the truth of non-separation. Again, we can navigate this because it's very subtle. If you hadn't have made the primal error, mula avidya, the primal error is to take nature as being separate from you and then rushing after it to join in with it, as if that's what's supposed to be done. Looking, the billions of souls are rushing to take bodies. I should do that. Like people going to, some great event that just happened out of nowhere. Everyone starts rushing to it. Oh, I should do that. But actually, it's just a big sinkhole somewhere where everyone dies when they get there. And dies again, then dies again, then dies again. So outside the body, you'll see there's a rush of souls along a particular channel way, a great nadi, that is leading to different worlds. And you just don't happen to notice that you're falling into lower worlds and you're leaving higher worlds. You should have remained at the heart, at the throat, at the third eye, at the crown, and not fallen like that. You should have kept yourself back and then seen at one point, with the Avatar's help, that all of that was folly. It was all a big dream that you didn't want to partake of anymore. So that, is uniting yourself with nature. If you say, we are united with nature, then people go, great, it's about time we did that, because we were mistreating nature so horribly, so we should unite with it. But nature has it all over you, has it so far above you. It already knows about birth, life, and death. That's its purpose. And you're going to buy into that and then think yourself to be born and die, and think yourself to be the owner of a mind that enjoys sorrow and happiness and suffers sorrow. Then you're just playing into nature's game. And that's why they say nature's insentient, consciousness is sentient. So this is where the separation happens. And when that separation happens, then you can call nature your own. When you called nature your own, when you saw it separate from you, that's when you begin to suffer. But if you see nature as being within you and you being the master of it, you can sport in the worlds. You can play in the fields of the Lord. Sri Ramakrishna said, here I can eat, drink, and be merry. There's nothing wrong with being here in the body in this world. So there's something very, very subtle in there that these great souls are knowing and basing their lives upon. And then this multitude of souls that don't know that are on this wheel that they can't get off of. They're helpless in the regime of Prakriti. So it's amazing. So you have to look then, maybe that one thing that they're aware of is the truth of non-separation, of Akshara Brahma, that doesn't get destroyed. Akhanda Satchidananda, it's indivisible. They have names for this, all applied to Brahman. So here, let's go by these statements to give a simple description again of this chart. The truth of non-separation. Nature is separate from soul only in consistency, not in locale. So remember that our founder, Lex Hixon, again, we'd be sitting and he'd say, you know, this room, this world, it's all in yourself. It's in your mind. There's no separate locale for it. In other words, there's no such thing as this room. There's no such thing as this world separate from Brahman. If you had fallen under this fascination, you would be here thinking everything is separate from you, including your wife and your children and your friends. You can't unite with them. They'll betray you at every step. Everything will betray you here. It will not satisfy you. That's the great teaching. You're trying to satisfy desire? That's impossible. Desire was when you saw nature, it's what made you, and it's why I couldn't fill it in there. It's that desire would be at the top of the list of the dynamics of the dynamics, you see. Is that when that soul came out of its deep sleep and bliss, when it saw nature, it desired it. If the soul came out and said, why do I want to go there? That just came out of me. I'm here already because I'm in one place. I don't move, I'm stationary. And so it wouldn't rush towards it. It would just observe it. This is what he's saying in his verses there. See, I'm just observing it now. I like to watch the wheels go round and round from a distance, but I don't want to participate in it anymore. And there are people who are here in some sort of state of enlightenment who do that. They're actually in it, but not of it, as the saying goes. So they'll watch the day go by, the night go by, and so forth. They'll watch the headlines in the newspapers and so forth. And they'll just observe it and say, yep, there it is again, going in cycles. And it's not myself that's doing that. And it's not their selves that's doing that either. They're just, the onerous phantom of the ego is guiding them into nature because it was fabricated by nature. The very sense of I am separate is the ego's identity. So nature is separate from soul only in consistency. Means what? That it's made of matter, changing particles, energy. And if you looked deeper, those two came from thought, but we can't get the scientists to go there yet, or even the Western psychologists to go there yet. When Holy Mother said, all objects are just thought made concretized. I don't think she could have hit the nail on the head any better for the sage than telling you that. Objects are just thought made concretized. I mean, she just cut to the chase when she said that. And then a person thought, well, that's my thought, and that tree is my thought, and that river and that ocean, that sunset I'm liking, that's my thought, and it's just manifesting out there because I did it. Then you've got the perfect union of soul with nature, based on the knowledge of the one self in all, not in the separation of many selves or fragmented parts. So consistency of things is matter, is particles, changing at a billionth of a second when you get right down to it. So that's what we mean by nature is different from us in consistency, but it's not different from us in locale, because there is no locale outside of Brahman. This is all Brahman. So these things rose in Brahman, yes, albeit out of thought. They lived in Brahman as manifested thought, and then they sunk down into the ocean of dissolution and became back to their source, dissolved back into their source. Everything is soluble in Brahman, is how Sri Ramakrishna put that. This great soul. Everything is soluble into Brahman. And so that even leaves it suspect as whether it was ever really solid in the first place in order to be dissolved, you see. So this is the samicca, praticca samutpata, the rising and falling of thoughts. And this soul can just as easily get hypnotized by that and get into nature through that avenue. And it can also just as easily say, that's just the mind working, I don't want to unite with it. Isn't that what he's saying here? I realized I had no mind that created all this. That wasn't mine. Might as well have been 8 billion other minds that were doing that. But it wasn't my mind. I disavow it, see. I dispossess myself of it, Father of Yoga said. So, nice few words, isn't it? Nature is separate from us only in consistency, not in locale. Because, for another reason, nature is within us. And that's the one locale. It's called Atman. There's no other locale than Brahman. These many worlds that I got seduced into were manufactured by the nature and the mind. So I'll put a stop to that, thank you very much, and I'll just live in the one world, see, the one indivisible Brahman. And he's trying to describe that in 40 verses here, and throughout this entire scripture, he's got different ways of saying that. That's a simple way of putting it. To go into depth a bit more, being a projection of the combined thought power of the Mahat and the Antakarana, nature is an expression of Brahman. So if you knew the great mind, because we said everything comes from mind, and it's not my mind, thank you very much, when the soul becomes realized. But then you think about this great mind called the Mahat, you might call it Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, and how at the level of that, which is like third eye kind of level of consciousness, pure awareness, that those worlds are magnificently beautiful without any gravity to them. They're not pulling you back down to a cycle of rebirth. Nobody ever accused the beings that live at the Agya chakra and the Vishuddha chakra of having a wheel of transmigration going on there that caused them suffering in return. They were taking on subtle bodies and giving them up of their own design because they had already transcended ignorance, which belongs to the three lower centers. So precisely why, from the standpoint of an illumined consciousness like Sri Ramakrishna's, then he sees all this as Brahman. This is how you can get into the Mahavakyas, Tattvamasi, Ayamatma Brahma, and Pragyanam Brahma, and Aham Brahmasmi, the four great sayings, and there's a few others that figure in there too. I was looking into Kevala Asti the other day, how beautiful that is, and a few others. Akhanda Satchidananda. So if your mind is at that level, then you're seeing all of this as an expression of Brahman. And you know where it came from. And you're not responsible for the projection of it. Because projection, sustenance, and withdrawal are all going on at a lower level of consciousness. Finally, we see here, appearing in some form at all levels of vibratory existence, nature is both manifester of primal substance and the facilitator of the relationship between matter and consciousness with form. So at this point, Prakriti becomes wielded in the hand of a great adept like Lord Brahma, and it can fashion all of these worlds out of them, and beings can sojourn there and return to their source. There's a matter of Videha Muktis who take one lifetime and then dissolve themselves back into the source, like a hailstone in an ocean, or the Jivan Muktas, sans, i.e. bodhisattvas, who come here, see that there are people who are falling into this problem of misapprehension and misidentification of the soul with matter, and trying to convince them otherwise and pull them out of that nosedive. See, point him inwards again, to inward transformation to the source, back to the true self and all. Your first time for this chart, also mine. It came out yesterday, and I hope there are no typos in it. I took a chance and just went ahead and printed it, and we can nurture it or add to it or refine it as time goes on, sometimes with these charts. But that gives us this deeper look into two factors. One is that, and most accented here, is that the mind's fascination with samsara, or with birth, life, and death, when the seers are constantly telling us, you're not born, you don't die. How do we make sense of that? Because Shankara is singing, and we like to sing it a lot. Na mrityur na shanka, na me jati beda, pita naiva me naiva, mata majanma, chidananda rupa, shivoham, shivoham. Chidananda Rupa Shivoham Shivoham. Namrityur Nashanka Name Jati Beta. So Jati, birth, Mritya, death. I can never die because I was never born. So this isn't just the word immortality, which is misleading. It's like applies to like the idea of Rome and Greece, immortality. That's where the word springs from. But I remember Lex Hickson once told me, don't use that word immortality, because it suggests that there's a mortal that's real, and there is no mortal that's real. Every being is that immortal Atman. But if you use immortal, then it has that connotation. It should just say eternal or birthless and deathless. That way, then you can pin it. You can peg it as what it is, and focus on it. One-pointed focus, like with this Agya chakra, with this this jnana chakshu, this eye of wisdom. I thought as I looked at this new chart that we could set it off with a chart that's also fairly new, but which will also make us approach the subject of nature carefully. There's the word in Sanskrit, chidabhasa, consciousness reflected through nature. And that is where sometimes the teacher and the teachings take us when we want to try and notice the distinction between Purusha and Prakriti, or the soul and matter. You should perceive that one power that is the origin and source of the relationship between consciousness and matter. If you can perceive what that is, then you can immediately cause the separation in non-separation. You could realize the oneness of everything with distinctions insinuating themselves upon it. But you'll never take the distinctions as being real. You only take the one homogeneity to be real. And so people will go into nature without these Advaitic axioms in mind, haven't been given to them. That's why Sri Ramakrishna told Swami Vivekananda about them when he was just a teenager, and told him that, you know, you should give all people these simple truths of non-duality and then have them practice to realize them. So that's why you want to introduce that first. Then they'll escape such demons and such problems as false identification with objects and attachment to pleasures and other problems that happen in nature. So in this way of thinking, I thought of my teacher, Swami Sheshananda. He said, light reflects poorly off of a rock. It reflects better off of a leaf. Off of a pool of water, it reflects even better, but off of a mirror, it reflects best of all. I remember him saying that several times in this context when he was trying to explain to his Western congregation there at the Vedanta Society of Portland back there in the 70s and 80s when we were attending it. And he knew that he had people there who were a kind of an admixture of the understanding of non-duality plus the presence of duality, and also some sentimentality, you might say, around the idea that God was somehow in nature. That got deep into the Americans, and it was there in the 60s when those young people that were there at that time also didn't lose their sentimentality when it had to do with renouncing objects and nature. They went away with it they went away from it because they objected to it, but they didn't renounce it. It's kind of what happened there. So there you can see the image there is this hand is just coming out of the tree, as if the tree were actually real and it can talk to you. And then, like in some fantasy, it can stand up on legs and walk away somewhere. So, nowadays you've got anime and animation things that are doing that all the time, and children are looking into that. So they're buying it, maybe that everything out here has consciousness in it. And we would probably be tempted to say, yes, it's true. Brahman is there. Brahman is conscious there, but it's not in the thing itself. It's in the Mahat. It's in the great mind that those things exist. Vivekananda made a beautiful clarifying statement about that. He said that the tree is, the treeness of the tree and the water, the liquidity of the water and so forth. He says those things are not the property of the tree and the grasses, and they're the properties of the Mahat. So that's how consciousness gets into everything that's made of matter, as an association of the mind and the thing that then comes out of consciousness. That what we just said basically when we were looking at this. It's an expression of Brahman, we said, or it's a relationship that nature and the soul are having with one another. And as soon as the soul is through with the relationship, playing with nature, then it will discard it. See, and discard it means take it back into its source inside the mind. And the Mahat is the greatest mind of all. So it will dissolve everything back into that. That's the Lord Shiva part of the great mind. He's the great dissolver. Brahma will project it, Vishnu will sustain it for ages, and Shiva will then say, game over. Just like draw the breath in and hold it. Everything gets dissolved. Its forms turn back to formlessness and become soluble. Other great quotes are there to help us understand this. That one, of course, is by degree, right? This quote, Swami Sheshananda, is by degree of how much of the Mahat's consciousness gets into any given thing. Obviously, it got into the human being in a big way, but not every human being, maybe not that many human beings, have that great intelligence in them that belongs to the Mahat, the great mind. And so Swami Sheshananda there was just saying basically that there's different reflection, different intensity of consciousness in different beings, just like there are in pieces of nature like that. And here's where Swami clarifies the society of the Mahat for us. It is said that plants have no consciousness, that they are best only unconscious wills. The answer is that even this unconscious plant will is a manifestation of consciousness, not of the plant, but of the cosmos, the Mahat of Samkhya philosophy. So it's a great thought. Water is a great thought at a much higher level than here. Fire, a great thought. Air, a great thought. Tree, a great thought. It's all being thought in the great mind of the Mahat. And so none of these things just pronounced here possess that consciousness. Mahat, the great mind, possesses it all and breathes it into them. That's what an expression is, you see. That's how it becomes expressed. So we don't want to take the expression as the real thing. That's what people are doing. And it's why they get fascinated with nature and will keep taking the unreal to be the real again and again, over and over again, without clarifying their mind, viveka khyati, about this one precious consciousness that cannot be matter, cannot be energy, and cannot be thought. It's of its own design. It's perfect, as I just chanted. Sadanga natu naiva shudam, mana vinasha natu naiva shudam, Guru padesha natu naiva shudam. Nothing can make that pure here. It's pure at the outset. It was pure from the get-go. It was pure from the originless origin of things. And when you concentrate on that, then you'll see everything dissolve into it and come out of it. The great mind, that is, the Mahat. And then there's the witness of the great mind. And you'll begin to learn about that. So that's another one of these marvelous sayings that Vivekananda thought about. Put it into just a couple sentences to clarify that for us. We think that there are conscious wills in all these trees and grasses and everything, but it's true there is, but it's not the will of the tree itself or the will of the grasses or the water or the hills or anything. It's the consciousness of the Mahat that's there. That's why you can look at anything and make it a meditation, right? Meditating on water, on fire, on earth, and you'll cut away the external beliefs, the false beliefs about it, and you'll see the actual essence of the thing. And you'll be enthralled with that instead of with the changing form. We want to become entirely enthralled with our Brahman nature. It's so much more vast and perfect than all of this, with all its beauty and imperfections. It would have to be if it came out of us. If Vivekananda got in a little bit more strict or sobering mood, he would say this: the only knowledge that is in any value is to know that all of this here is humbug. But few, very few, will ever know this. Know the Atman alone and give up all other vain words. This is the only knowledge we gain from all this knocking about the universe. Spoken by a soul who, automatically has this Advaitic knowledge in hand fully, full realization of it, if he decides to enter the worlds of name and form and take on a body. 38 years of embodiment. 32 for Shankar. And you can see the beautiful scene here: waterfall, the fish, the water, the trees, everything. And we can end with this quote of my Guru, Swami Sheshananda. He said, if consciousness were to reflect out and identify with the element of water, it could assume the form of a fish. If it were to identify mainly with two of the five senses, like hearing and smelling, it might take on a dog's form. If it were to identify with the unripe human ego, it would become an ignorant human being. And if it were to identify with the refined human mind, it would become an intelligent being. And then, of course, there's that truth that if it decides not to identify with any aspect of nature, it'll just identify with its own true nature, of which the Avadhut has been explaining so nicely to us here. Jnanamritam samarasam gaganopamoham Jnanamritam samarasam gaganopamoham Jananim Sharadam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padopadme Toye Shritva Pranamami Mahur Mahur Pranamami Mahur Mahur. O Ramakrishna, teacher of all, O Sharada, goddess divine, in bosom holding those lotus feet, salutations ever be of mine.